They say that patience is a virtue, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily my strong suit, right? Like, nobody likes to wait, but for some of us, it comes with a special degree of difficulty. We just have this thing in us that is not all that patient. And yet, what I have seen time and time again is that God's redemptive work in this world, and for that matter, God's redemptive work in me, doesn't always move as quickly as I would prefer. There are times when God is at work doing what God does, and it moves slowly. And I think our personal experience would affirm what Scripture reveals, that God is at work in this world, redeeming, restoring, and making all things new. We see the evidence of that. We see the glimpses of it at various times in various ways. And yet, His timing doesn't always align with my impatience. Is that fair enough to say? Can you relate to that sense that I think God's doing something, I just wish He'd hurry up about it? And so the reality is, if it's the tension in which we live, if we want to pursue God's call, we're going to have to learn to wait, and wait well. Right? You know the difference between the two? You do whether you realize it or not, right? Anybody can wait. Waiting well is something you have to work at. Right? The guy in line in front of you at the DMV who is tapping his foot and sighing heavily every couple of minutes and checking his watch, he's waiting. He's not waiting well. Because waiting is just this thing that can passively happen. Like, it's something that's outside of your control most of the time, because if it was in your control, probably wouldn't be waiting. But waiting well, that's completely within your control. When you find yourself waiting well becomes a decision, an intentionality that says, well, guess we're waiting. So now I get to choose how I will wait. And as we continue this conversation about the family line, which we saw last week, we'll see more throughout the weeks ahead. This family line that was promised to Abram, it includes all of those who by faith are in Christ. And as we get into Abram's story more and more, what we'll find is that waiting is not a new feature in God's redemptive work in this world. It's one of those things that has often accompanied what God is most invested in doing in this world. If you were with us last week, you will remember the beats of the story that we set into, and you may be familiar with it, but in the big picture, let's see if we can sum it up. The word of the Lord comes to a man named Abram, and God says, I want you to leave three things. I want you to leave your country, your family, and your father's house. Those are the building blocks of his culture, of his identity, and God says, I want you to surrender all of those things. And I want you to go to a land that I will show you. The text we looked at last week told us that Abram went. And the big why in all of it that God reveals to Abram is, I want you to leave from these things and go to this place so that I can bless you, so that I can make you a blessing, and through you and through your family line, bless all the peoples of the earth. Like, that's a big calling. But it's pretty vague. Is it not? Like, okay, God, what's that look like? Well, I'll tell you. I'll show you. You just have to wait. It's a big call, but it's really vague. And what we see is throughout the course of the storyline of the Bible as a whole is that vague calling begins to take shape and come into focus. Ultimately, the New Testament focuses it through the person of Jesus. And it's by his death and resurrection that God creates this big, diverse family of faith that he promised to Abraham. But in the midst of Abram's story, Jesus is still like 2,000 years in the future. Which means there's going to be a lot of waiting between the promise as it is given and the promise as it will be fulfilled. And so Abram hears the word of the Lord. I want you to leave from these things and go to this place. He obeys immediately. And if you were with us last week, you'll recall at the end of that, at the end of his obedience, the text sneaks this little line in that says, and the Canaanites were still in the land. And we saw how Abram built an altar to the Lord. How he began to settle in to the place of the promise. And then the story takes a turn. I invite you to turn to Genesis chapter 12 again today. We're going to begin here and then move the story forward. But just after Abram has built an altar to the Lord while the Canaanites are still in the land, we read this in verse 10 of Genesis 12. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. It would not be uncommon in the world of the ancient Near East, particularly in this part of the region, for there to be widespread seasons of famine. Some of that is rooted in the nature of the climate there. The land of Canaan is dependent on rainfall for its agricultural cycle to keep up. You'll remember that oftentimes throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites kind of bump heads with the Canaanites, particularly over the worship of Baal. The Israelites seem to be really susceptible to the worship of Baal. Part rooted in this very idea. Baal was the storm god. He's the guy who brings the rain in Canaanite thinking, in Canaanite religion. And so if your entire livelihood and the stability of your family, your clan, your people is based in the continuing of the agricultural cycle, it's really easy to go, we want to keep that guy happy. Right? Make sense? And so when seasons would come where there was not a lot of rainfall, when it was drier than normal, famine could easily become the result. Now the contrast with that is to a place like Egypt. Egypt's agricultural cycle was driven by the Nile River. And so, yes, there are rivers, there are waters throughout Canaan, yes, but not like the Nile. Not to the depth, the scale, the scope of the Nile. And so Egypt oftentimes, even in times of famine in Canaan, Egypt could become a safety net, a place of provision. And so here's Abram. He's come to Canaan, the place that God has promised to show him. He's built an altar and he has prepared to wait. And then the famine comes. And Abram sets out for Egypt because the famine had lasted a while. And the famine had grown severe. And if you've ever found yourself pursuing God's call, and then you look around and realize you are in a season of prolonged waiting for the fulfillment of God's promises, this is a scenario you might recognize. It's there in the notes if you want to jot it down. You see, guys, while pursuing God's call, opportunities exist to be derailed by distractions. While pursuing God's call, opportunities will exist for you to be derailed by distractions. Now, throughout the Old Testament story, when God's people move toward Egypt, it often symbolically represents a move away from their calling as God's people, their identity as God's people. Egypt becomes a bit of a crutch at times, militarily, politically. Throughout the prophets, we see this sprinkled in. Oftentimes, when we see God's people in the Old Testament moving toward Egypt, there is this shift away from their calling. So God has led Abram to Canaan. He's promised to give it to his offspring, which means this was never going to happen instantly. Right? God tells Abram that. This land, I'm going to give it to your descendants. There's some waiting automatically built into that. And so, in the midst of his waiting, Abram sets out for Egypt. Abram needs physical resources, and so he goes where the resources are. And when you find yourself waiting amidst God's calling, amidst God's promises, it is easy to get distracted and start to go a different way. Right? God called, you followed, but now you're just kind of waiting. And so you start to look for answers. You start to look for something to do, for somewhere to go, because surely God did not call you simply for you to wait. Except that sometimes He does. Sometimes God calls you to follow Him from a place, or from some things to a place, knowing that the promise is down the line. And in the meantime, your obedience becomes waiting. And it becomes learning to wait well. Because while pursuing God's call, opportunities will exist to be derailed by distractions. The next thing we read, if we were to continue on in Genesis 12, and we need to skip ahead a bit today, so I want to summarize what happens in this sojourn in Egypt. As they're on their way there, Abram pulls his wife Sarai aside, and he tells her, I am afraid of what might happen when we go to Egypt. You are such an incredibly beautiful woman. My fear is that Pharaoh will see you, and he will want to take you for his wife. And so if that's what he wants to do, clearly he has no use for me. So I'm afraid that Pharaoh will kill me so that he can get to you. So here's what we'll do. We'll tell everyone in Egypt that you're my sister. Because the thinking goes like this: if Pharaoh does see Sarai, and he does consider her beautiful, and he does want to make her one of his wives, then he has to treat Abram well, because in the absence of their father, he must be the one responsible for Sarai's well-being. Can we pause? Side note, this has nothing to do with the big picture of what we're talking. But ladies, find a guy who at 65 considers you so beautiful that he thinks the king of Egypt would kill to have a shot with you. And fellas, treat your wives like Christ loves his church, that despite the blemishes, the wrinkles, and all the imperfections, he sees her spotless. Right? Like, there's something in that matters deeply as what it means to live out being a part of the people of God. So anyway, back to the text here. Abram sets out this plan. And so they go to Egypt and they tell everyone this is his sister. And it kind of works. Almost. Pharaoh does see her and he does take her into his palace. But because of that, the Lord brings judgment on Pharaoh's house. The specific words the text uses is that he unleashes a plague upon Pharaoh. It's the same language we get in the Exodus story when God strikes down the firstborn of Pharaoh's household. It's the same kind of language, so there's some connections here being made to the bigger story of God's people. And Pharaoh does some investigating and finds out what happens. And so he comes back to Abram and he says, "You set me up. This is not okay. Take your wife. Here's a bunch of stuff. Here's some servants. Here's some livestock. Here's some money. And go." And he kicks him out of Egypt. Which also kind of sounds a lot like what happens at the end of the Exodus story when Pharaoh says, "Here's a bunch of stuff. Now get your people and go," right? And so all of a sudden, now, Abram finds himself on the move again. Now, where to? Will he return to the place where he got distracted and continue waiting? Will he find a new place? Will he maybe go all the way back to Ur of the Chaldeans, where his father set out from a generation before? I mean, he's a man with options, and now he's a man with some means. And it sets up the next scene in the story in Genesis 13. Let's pick the text back up there in verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. And from the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And soon quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. And the Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. It's not the whole land before you. Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." And Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt toward Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. And the two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. So after this time in Egypt, Abram sets out with great wealth. And the text reminds us that Lot, his nephew, is still with him, right? Lot doesn't get mentioned in this little side trip to Egypt, but the text wants us to remember, oh yeah, Lot is still with Abram. He's still a part of this household. He's still a part of this story. And what we find is that because of his connection to Abram, Lot also has been blessed. Lot also has great wealth. He has flocks and herds of his own and servants who are overseeing his household. And they both have become so great, the text tells us that the land could not support them both. And then there's this little reminder that the Canaanites and Perizzites were in the land at that time, a reminder of exactly why is it that we're waiting for the fulfillment of God's promises? Oh yeah, because the land he's promised to give Abram's descendants already has people in it. So the land can't support the growing wealth of Abram and Lot, and soon quarreling breaks out between their servants. And Abram says, let's not let the quarreling amongst our servants turn into a full-blown family feud, Lot. What do you say we separate and each go our own way? Like, we'll set out, we'll find land that we can both inhabit where we won't have this kind of difficulty. And all of a sudden, there's another opportunity for God's call to Abram to be derailed by distractions. At first, it was a famine. Now it seems to be abundance. Abundance of servants, abundance of herds, abundance of tents, so much that the land can't support them. And we start to get a sense of how these distractions work, because sometimes we only think of distractions as the bad stuff that happens that causes us to give up and quit. But distractions from God's call can take the form of hardship or success. Distractions from what God has called you to do can take the form of either hardship or success. Not everything that distracts from the call of God will take the shape of adversity. It just won't. There will be opportunities to be distracted when things are going well. When all of a sudden you go, we just have too many herds and too many flocks, I just don't know what to do with them all. And the question in those moments becomes, how do we faithfully steward what we have into the shape of what God has called us to do? Here, the opportunity exists for them to be distracted by their success. The very success that is a byproduct of Abram's obedience to God. Right? Leave from these things to the place I will show you so that I can bless you. And now God has blessed him. And that blessing becomes the very thing that can distract him from pursuing the call. And that's the choice that sits before Abram in this moment. Hardship took him to Egypt, and now success drove him out. So what next? He defers that decision to Lot as to where he will go. Right? He proposes this separation, this split between their two encampments. And in line with customs of being a good host, playing hospitality in the right way, Abram defers to Lot first. Now, the cultural convention would have us say that Lot, especially as the younger of the two, would turn around and say, oh, no. You choose, and I'll go the other way. Right? Like, there's a bit of a cultural expectation here. I'm going to do the right thing and propose you choose. But we both know, really, I'm the elder. I'm kind of over you. I should probably get to pick. So Abram poses this choice to Lot. And Lot lifts his eyes and sees that the whole plain is well watered like the garden of God. That's Eden. It's well watered like Egypt, the place we just went because there was a drought that led to a famine that caused us to pack everything up and move. Lot lifts his eyes and looks across the well-watered plain and leaves the dry, rocky hill country to Abram. And so the next step in the story of Abram is Abram now dwells alone in the land of Canaan. And Lot, we're told, pitched his tent near Sodom, which will have huge ramifications for this story moving forward. As we'll see, if we were to keep reading into chapter 14, that's going to lead to Lot getting kidnapped by the king of Sodom and Abram having to rally an army to go and rescue him. In a couple weeks, we'll see how it puts Lot at the center of the story when God pours out his judgment on the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah that was just introduced to us here in the text. That decision is not going to be without implications for the rest of the way the story of God's calling plays out. But suffice it for now, at least, to say that Lot goes and God comes to Abram and reaffirms his promise. He says, Abram, lift up your eyes. The same phrase that's used to describe Lot's assessment of the land, God comes to Abram and says, lift up your eyes and survey the land. Look to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, as far as your eye can see. That is what I will give to your offspring. Offspring that God here promises will be descendants who are like the dust of the earth, uncountable. But not yet. So Abram is back to waiting. And like we said at the outset, nobody likes waiting. And when you find yourself waiting, it's tempting to be distracted, either by hardship or by success. But here, God calls Abram back to the foundation of the promise and focuses Abram's attention on what will be. Abram, we got off track. We went to Egypt. We had a whole thing there. We got back. Now Lot's leaving. Lots of opportunities to be distracted. But Abram, come back to what I told you. I will bless you and make you a blessing. The land that I promised to show you, I will give to your descendants, who will be as uncountable as the dust of the earth. And no matter what happens, when you find yourself waiting, there will be opportunities to get distracted. So if we want to get past that, we've got to figure out how to overcome the distractions. And I think we get a hint of that here in what God does for Abram by recentering and refocusing his attention on the promise of the call. You see, overcoming distractions requires a vision of what could be and a continued commitment to the call. Overcoming the distractions that will lead you outside of God's promises requires a vision of what could be and a continued commitment to the call. What does Abram do? He builds an altar to the Lord. There's this running theme. When Abram isn't sure what to do, but he needs to double down on the promises of God, he builds an altar. And he says, okay, Lord, I'm back in. I'm re-engaged. I'm ready to obey. And God here reminds Abram of what the goal was when he asked him to go from these things to a place. It was the promise that I will bless you and I will make you a blessing and I will bless all the peoples on earth through you, and I will raise up a family too large for anyone to count. So Abram builds his altar. He recommits himself to waiting on what could be because he trusts that God's calling means what could be is what will be. Do you see where faith all of a sudden takes center stage for Abram? Because he trusts that because God has called, God has led him, and because he has obeyed, that what could be is what will be. When you're pursuing the call of God, overcoming distractions is going to require that vision of what could be and a continual recommitment to this call. As a community of faith, as a local church, we've sensed God calling us in this time, in this place, to live out the reality of what it means to be the diverse family of faith that God promised to Abram. And fueling that vision is a belief that what could be, that picture we say, what might happen if God allowed us to begin reaching our neighbors of the various ethnicities and diversities around us? What could happen? What could be? Fueling that is this idea that what could be reflects what will be. We fast forward to the New Testament and beyond. We find words we've seen time and time again from the Apostle John, one of Jesus' first disciples, who's shown a vision of God's throne. And he sees a vision of how God's ultimate purposes reflect the promise to Abram. Just before this, in Revelation chapter 7, as the judgments of God are being doled out, John says, I heard the one who was on the throne say to an angel, "Hold back destruction until I have sealed all those who belong to the servants of God." And then he enumerates them out. 12,000 from each tribe of Israel gets named. The difficulty is Israel's long since not been a country. The tribes have been muddled and lost along the way. But tribe by tribe, the family of Abraham is enumerated out until the total is 144,000. And then John writes this: "Afterward, I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count. From every nation, every tribe, every people, and every language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb.'" This multitude that John has just told us is made up of the tribes, the descendants of Abram, all of a sudden gives way to a multitude drawn from all peoples of the earth, who, like the dust of the earth, are uncountable. Church, I can't help but think we are waiting. We have heard God's call to reach the diversity of our community so that we begin to reflect this big, diverse family of faith that God promised to Abram. And along the way, already there are right now, and there will continue to be opportunities to get distracted. There will be moments of hardship, and there will be moments of success, and the temptation will be to direct our eyes away from the call that God has placed before us. So in our pursuit of God's calling, let us not be distracted from what could be. Instead, let's remain committed to the calling as we pursue what we know will be. Would you stand with me as the band comes back and we have a close in prayer?